is going to be able to join us as we go throughout. We are recording this meeting, so if you have to step out for a little bit, don't worry, you're welcome to catch back up later. So I wanted to start with a hello. My name is Chelsea Green, and I'm the regional director here in the South Peninsula region of AJ Tutoring. So that includes the Palo Alto, Los Altos, and Mountain View offices. And a little bit about me, I've been with the company for almost 12 years now. And throughout that time have done a variety of different jobs within the company. Started as a tutor, have been tutoring my entire 12 years here, but have also run our social outreach programs and our math programs. And now as the regional director, manage kind of the operations, the hiring, and the general tutoring training here in the company. So I'm excited to talk to you about study skills today, but also have kind of a lot of context for the company. So, happy to chat about that as well. And then I'm joined by.
Yeah, and I'm Micah Glass-Siegel. I am the Los Altos office director for the Fremont Avenue office. And I have been with AJ a little over 5 years now. Before that, I was a classroom educator, a classroom teacher, both for middle school and high school. So I bring a little bit of that experience as well.
Excellent. So we are here today to talk about study skills. So our agenda is as such. So we're going to talk a little bit about how learning works, what our students are up against when they are, integrating new information. And then we want to talk about some specific study skills that we think are going to be really helpful for all of the students as they approach their more difficult classes. And then we're going to end today with a Q&A. So Mike and I are going to try to, keep our focus on the presentation. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, but I would really save those for the Q&A. We won't be necessarily answering those live as we're going. This, is supposed to be a kind of stepping stone. Each student is going to be unique in how they study best. So we really want to give you resources to start thinking about what's going to work well for your student. So as we present things, you can kind of take what you feel like will work well for you.
Awesome. So to get us started, what is learning, right? I think it's important to remember learning is a process, not a product. Is it, if I do that? Yeah. And that learning involves change, right? Change in knowledge or beliefs, behaviors, or attitudes. And finally, in some ways, perhaps most importantly, right? Learning is not something that we do to someone else, right? Learning is something that happens up here, right? That students do for themselves or as adults also. And so it's really about helping our students, our children, to be able to do the learning on their own, obviously with the supports that we as educators and parents are providing. So I wanted to open a little bit to talk a little bit about student-parent relationships. Obviously, of course, right? The relationships between parents and children are varied and complex. And I think, some of us maybe still have or had in the past complicated relationships with our own parents. But I would ask us to pause for a second, think about opportunity, times in the office at our own work where a supervisor maybe came in and challenged our decisions, or maybe, we were working on something, we thought it was all good, and then all of a sudden a supervisor changes the goal. And how that can really be challenging, right? And I'm guessing the vast majority of us don't live with our bosses. And so, to sort of keep that in mind of how potentially it feels for our students. Learning is a process, as I just said, and that, right, process is key, right? It doesn't happen overnight. When kids are younger, we are potentially able, maybe, right, to impose our goals, our desires on our children. But of course, this becomes harder and harder as kids get older and seek more independence. And so figuring out, even if it's not easy, those places where we can be collaborative and advocate with our students and not, and really build up that buy-in. And then also all of this, whether we're talking about study skills or a million other things in the lives of children, it's an iterative process, right? If what we try at first is not working, we try something else. I find, and I do this both with my own biological children and also with the students that I work with, that often it's helpful to make it less personal. Right? It's not you're not working, kid. It's if it's not working, right? The thing that we tried is not working. And I find even if we in our heart really believe it's not about us, it's really like the kid messed up, I still think it's helpful because, right, it can lower some of that hostility that I think, sometimes is there. And all right, we're going back to the drawing board. We're going to try again. And then when thinking about goals in general, I find that smaller sustainable goals, in some cases, even a goal that feels maybe too small, tends to be better than taking a really large goal, but that isn't really going to happen, right? We can always build on the success, but I think it, can be really demoralizing for students who feel like they're really trying and that it's just they're not gaining the traction, right? So I like to start small. And then finally, there's always the opportunity to provide outside support, whether it's AJ Tutoring or other professionals. Again, because these relationships are so varied and so complex, sometimes it is helpful to have sort of like a neutral third party who can kind of mediate and also provide maybe some of the things that you would have said anyway, but it might feel different for the student coming from somebody else. So thinking about our students and learning specifically. So, right, students' prior knowledge can help or unfortunately can hinder learning. This is true both in terms of, a strong foundation, right? It is pretty clear in mathematics, right? If a student really struggled, to gain the concepts last year, that's obviously going to be a problem this year. But attitudes are also come into play here, right? A bad relationship with a teacher in the past can sour a student, whereas a really positive relationship can help, even if the student finds the material to be really challenging. And then how students organize knowledge, right, influences how they learn and how they can apply what they know. So, all of us, right, people, we make connections as we learn. We're constantly trying to connect to what we, the worldview that we already have. If those connections are accurate and are meaningful, that can really be helpful. One of the subjects I tutor is history. And I tell all my students early in the process, right, if history is a million random facts, good luck. I don't know how any of us could do that. But if instead we're thinking about how to create interconnected webs of knowledge, right, it can really help that when we have new information, it can just sort of sit on that tree, on that web that we've created, right, which is a much more effective way to learn.
Great. So we want to start with our first study skill of memorization and internalization. And that is one of the switches I might suggest. I find that when I say to a student, you need to memorize this, I get an immediate negative reaction. I have a negative reaction at the thought that I might need to memorize something. So something you'll hear me say a lot in my personal tutoring, instead of like, how are you going to memorize this, is how are you going to internalize this? And so the first thing I want to think about is like, why is it so difficult to internalize things? And that's because this is how our brains are set up. The first time we get information, our brain immediately starts forgetting it. And we have this thing called the forgetting curve, where you immediately start forgetting it. And it's not until you've been re-exposed to the information, think about it again, bring it back up, that the forgetting curve kind of shallows out. So it's really important to remember that, not only is it it's not weird for someone to not remember something the first time they hear it, it's expected, right? And it's not, it's good that we are thinking about this and not just saying to students, like, memorize it, be done. Like, we have this process for retaining things. So I wanted to talk about a couple different techniques for internalization or memorization. So the first is just really diving into that forgetting curve. We know we have the forgetting curve. We know we need repeated exposure to our information. So making sure that our studying is set up to get that. It is so tempting to cram the night before. As a tutor for 12 years, I can tell you it doesn't work. It's not going to work in a way that is going to be productive for the student long term. So it is going to take some more executive functioning to get ourselves to study earlier. We're going to talk some techniques later on there, and it is super important in making sure that we are actually retaining this information. Next up is active recall. So making sure that students are using their brain when they're taking the information. I've had so many students who say like, oh, like, I'm like, how did you study? And it's like, I read my notes. And it's like, was that helpful to you? No, because you've already done those notes. And yes, maybe it was a little bit helpful to see the information again, but you need to kind of test yourself on what you know and what you don't. So this is where flashcards come in. This is where tests come in, right? That's a very good application of active recall, making sure we are bringing that information back up to the surface. Next up is mnemonic devices. So for kind of our common stuff, especially in like chemistry and math, or I guess probably history as well, but I teach math and test prep, there are some really solid mnemonic devices. My advice with students is if you remember that mnemonic device, awesome. But if you can create kind of a fun, wonky one that is specific to your interests, it's probably going to stick a little bit better. So kind of determining what you want to internalize and then creating a mnemonic device that is, going to be fun for you. I still have some kind of silly ones for my college chemistry classes. Next up is a little bit more advanced, but visualization and association. So if we can put information in physical spaces, our brain can do a better job of recalling that information when we kind of put ourselves in that physical space. So an example of this might be if you're studying for a Spanish test and you need to internalize a lot of groups of words, you might put 5 flashcards in the bathroom and 5 flashcards in the kitchen and 5 flashcards in the bedroom. So then when your brain is trying to recall that information, they are physically grouped in your mind. This could be a more, metaphorical grouping. This could be on a mind map, but the thinking about things in visual space is very helpful for internalizing things. If you can use your senses, all the better. If the flashcards are fun, colors, smells, maybe. Next up is teaching others. As tutors, we very much know the power of internalizing information by teaching others. As parents, it can be a little bit tricky, but if we can, set up a space where the student is teaching you what they learned that day, awesome. This may be a little bit more effective, like a younger sibling or a group or classmate, but going through the process of teaching someone else how to do something is extremely rewarding and then also very beneficial for the student. And finally here is physical activity. It's kind of a hard sell for a lot of students, but really just integrating a little bit of physical activity into their day, into their studying, can do worlds of help for actually internalizing things long term. So this could be a little walk after they finish studying. This could be whatever sport they play. Could be going swimming. Whatever physical activity works well for them, but giving their brain that time and that space to process. And we can also combine a lot of these techniques, right? Like maybe we're going on a nice little walk after dinner and the student's teaching us what they learned that day, or we're going through their mnemonic devices. So lots of different memorization techniques here, internalization, and it's really about kind of what works well for your student and, the specific subject may be different.
All right, so when we think about note-taking, there are many, many different methods. Obviously, some teachers have very strong opinions or very strong requirements, right? And certainly if a classroom teacher says it has to be this way, so be it. But other than that, right, the key is really about finding what works for the student for this specific class, right? It sort of makes sense that, right, a strategy that worked in chemistry might not be the same note-taking strategy I need for my English class. And what worked last year in English might not work now that I'm in AP Literature. And so, again, thinking about what's going to be sustainable for the student and what's going to serve the needs that this class provides. So when we're thinking about our note-taking, part of it really starts as we prepare for class. Ideally, maybe this is the night before. At a minimum, we can help students to get in the habit of just looking at where their notes ended off from last period. And that as a teacher is lecturing, right, there's just not going to be time to note everything. And so helping students to really focus on the main ideas for this, right, for lecture notes or class notes. Definitely, we want to abbreviate. Right, the goal of the notes is to be understandable to the student, not to somebody else later on. And so there's certainly a balance that is going to look a little bit different depending on the individual student. And then thinking about formats, one popular format is Cornell Notes. The way that works is you take the page, and certainly there are online resources where you can like print one out, but it's a little bit unnecessary to go that far, where roughly 1/3, you have like a column, 1/3, and then 2/3. So in the main body of the text, that's where you keep your notes. And the official Cornell note sort of strategy doesn't actually tell you exactly what format the main notes should take. So, you know, all sorts of different things can work. But the key is that in this side column on the left-hand side, you put key questions. And these are the key questions that a student can use later on when they're reviewing their notes to make sure that they actually do understand what the goal is or what the method is or the big ideas. And then you reserve the bottom 5 to 7 lines of page at the bottom for a summary. And part of the key here is, even if, you know, I'm furiously taking my notes in class and I have to go on to the next page, even though the teacher is still going, I still want to have that summary at the bottom, even if it's kind of mid idea. And part of the reason this was developed is to create something that was going to be more active, right? The act of creating the summary is going to help activate my thought to make sure I actually understood what's going on. And maybe if I don't, I say, oh, I better go back after class and make sure I understand. And that when I review, that I have the things I need to have a more active interaction with these notes later. In terms of reading, right? Again, different classes sort of call for different things, but definitely we want that internalization, right? The student is sort of thinking about what they're reading to then write. And so ideally we want to be taking notes from memory and not just copying furiously from the book itself. Depending on, you know, if it's possible, marking directly in the text can be really helpful. Again, a Cornell Notes format can work in terms of still having the key questions and summary. Definitely there are all kinds of app-based or digital-based note systems, right? Evernote is one of them that we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then creating a concept map, right? For some subjects, you know, sort of linear text is really helpful, whereas for others, you know, if we're talking about the carbon cycle or things like that, right, having a diagram is really going to be much more effective. So again, part of the goal, so we are reading, you know, whether it's from text or from lecture, we're picking up these individual ideas, right, this individual knowledge, and we're beginning, right, through the teaching, through the homework, through studying, through potentially a tutor, right, to ally these ideas together, to string them together into larger concepts. Maybe it's applying, you know, a specific type of formula in mathematics, so that ideally, eventually, right, everything can fit together into this larger framework. And ultimately, right, it's not only about the framework of this one course or this one unit, right? It's about connecting things together so that we can have a deeper understanding of, you know, sort of certainly the academic subject, but really the world around us. All right, so our third principle is students' motivation, right, determines, directs, and sustains what they do learn. So motivation, right, as students gain independence, motivation plays a really critical role. And obviously, certainly when we're talking about teenagers, right, for us as outsiders, creating motivation is a challenge. But 3 things we can sort of keep our eye on is helping to develop, right, a positive value in the learning goal or the activity. And that might be the assignment itself. It might be a larger goal, right? I have career goals, and therefore, even though I don't like this class, I know that I need it to get there. Or, you know, I am aspiring to a specific college, right, or whatever it is. And then, so another piece that is important for motivation is the expectation that I can be successful. And I would say that we therefore need to be really careful of what success looks like, right? If I as a student feel like maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but if I feel like there's no way I can get an A in this class, well, then I feel like I can't be successful. And maybe therefore success needs to look different, at least in the short term, so that I can build up that motivation so that I can sort of internally believe that really I can get there. And then a third factor here is the perception of support. And certainly, right, in a million different ways, we as parents and educators can do that.
Perfect. Okay, well, I want to talk about creating a space for effective studying environment. You know, where we're studying can be really impactful on our learning, and want to, you know, help our students build that. So thinking about an effective study environment, there's a lot I think about, and it's really going to work differently for each student. But I mean, the first thing I really want to think about is the space. Where are they studying? We had so many students in COVID, you know, by necessity, who were doing most of their work on the bed or on the couch. And it really just is not going to set us up for success, because there's the distraction of everything around us, and honestly sleep, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So first thing I really ask students to do is have a space where they are designated to study. This space then has all of the supplies we need to effectively study. And that's going to be kind of dependent on the age of the student and how their school is structured. But like, let's have all our textbooks all in one place, right? Let's not have to go on a hunt every night when I need to switch homework. I am someone who is incredibly motivated by office supplies. So if that's your student, let's have a nice little folder there where they're excited to put their homework in it. Let's make sure their favorite pencil's there. Something that my students continually forget is that, like, they're probably going to need an eraser, and it's probably going to need to be bigger than the one that's provided on their mechanical pencil. So making sure that they have just absolutely everything they need in their supplies, super helpful there. Next up is making sure we have an organizational technique that works well for your unique student. So this could be something like, you know, again, very motivated by office supplies. So math is blue, and then we have our blue folder, we have our blue notebook, we have all of our blue stuff over here. And then switching over to history, I have the physical kind of change. But that could look different for your student. Like, your student might be motivated on having the most efficient organizational system as possible. I've had a lot of students with ADHD, and just students who struggle with organization in general really love to have a just accordion folder where this section is math, this section is history, and it's not the nicest within the folder, but at least all of the math supplies are together, all the history supplies are together, and there's nothing at the bottom of their backpack. I would also check the backpack every so often. We always lose things in there, so just make sure that's good. Next up is sleep and nutrition. We'll talk about sleep in more depth a little bit later, but really just making sure when we're preparing to study that our bodies are ready to do so. So sleep is really important. Make sure we're getting consistent, nutritious meals. Really important to fuel our brain and fuel our studying. I know a hard sell, but anything you can do there, super helpful. We also want to make sure that we are managing stress. I have a lot of students who, you know, kind of sit down to do their homework, and instead of putting their energy into these challenging problems and their attention and everything, they're really, you know, kind of spiraling on the fact that they're stressed out about this course or something else entirely. So making sure that our space is effectively set up, and also our brain is ready to engage with the content we're about to engage with. And then finally, I like to mention that having a really effective study environment can also be a really great communication tool within a family. So, you know, if we have a place where we are sitting down to do our work, and I have a list of my tasks and I'm checking those off as I go, a parent doesn't need to come over and ask, like, are you studying? Like, it's very clear that they're studying, and students can communicate to the family without like having that discourse that I'm currently studying, and I'm like, you know, I'm working towards the goals that we have set together. So I think great communication tool there. I want to take a little bit of time in this section to talk about screen time. And I know this is really hard, and it's really going to be, you know, again, just so unique for each student and family. But it's something that we get a lot of questions about, and it's something that we hear a lot from families about being, you know, kind of an issue or something that's hindering students. So I think we want to start with the fact that, you know, that this very much is a digital world, and screen time is often a kind of unavoidable distraction. So what we're going to be doing here, just like with the other study skills, is building a plan that works well for your family. And when you're building that plan, I kind of recommend considering a couple of the following. So the first off is just like taking the time to just remember why students are so drawn to screens. You know, these for a lot of students are their main social connection. It's a little bit different than when we grew up, and this is where they are communicating with their friends. This is where they're getting all of their kind of fun information. And it's also, you know, I think about a lot, it's really a dopamine machine. It's a really quick way to get a nice feeling when, you know, maybe the history homework wasn't so interesting, or maybe the math homework wasn't so interesting. And I think it's really important that we notice when that happens, when we are using our phones as a distraction to get out of the critical thinking that comes with studying. Because if we notice that, if we say like, hey, I read this question and then my brain said, you know, where did sloths originate? And then I looked at that for 20 minutes. I can notice like, I didn't actually really care about the sloths. I just wanted to get out of this problem. And then we can start to notice on a meta level, you know, how do I approach that? Like if I see that in myself, how can I, you know, stop myself? How can I redirect? So making sure we're kind of keeping that in mind. And then I think it's really important to be empathetic when we're talking about screen time. You know, this is something where it's a problem for adults too. And, you know, kind of screen time is an issue for these adults, and it's also something that students have a lot of examples of around them where people are using screens all the time. And so if we just say like, you know, get off your phone, like they're not seeing that around them. So really making sure we're practicing empathy there. But then when thinking about kind of like actual guidelines, again, going to really depend on your family. But with younger students, we think what we've seen works best is just setting boundaries on the time and the time of day. It's really hard to go back on these boundaries once they've been set. So making sure that as you're setting those boundaries and experimenting those boundaries, these are boundaries that, you know, both you and the student are somewhat on board with, and that you feel like it's sustainable for your family. And for older students, it really is more intricate. So this is going to be a collaborative goal setting exercise. And what I try to focus on with my students is making sure that they're thinking about like, am I getting what I want out of screen time? You know, are they on their phone and actually getting a break? Like they say they're taking a break, or are they just getting distracted and now is their homework taking twice as long as they wanted it to? You know, are they connecting with friends, or did they just get dragged into a rabbit hole that they didn't actually care about? And it's not going to be perfect. We are, you know, going to fall down these rabbit holes as they come. But if we can notice that happening and have conversations around it, I've been, you know, very pleasantly surprised when talking to my students about their phone use, in that they notice that that's not how they wanted to spend their time, and they are looking for ways to, you know, reduce these issues. But also this is a dopamine machine where all their friends are, so helping them kind of build that balance. Some like productive examples of things we might implement as tutors or as parents is making sure, just like we have a productive physical working space, we also have productive digital spaces. So like a really solid example that I do with a lot of my students is we have a personal login on their computer, and we have a work or a school login on their computer. And on the school login, there aren't any of the fun apps. There aren't you know, anything that could be distracting. It's just everything they would need for doing their homework. So once they do their homework, they get to log out of that and be done. And same with when they're on their personal time, they're not getting distracted by seeing, you know, Canvas updates or anything. It's just they get to be on their personal time. One thing I do see really get in the way of a lot of students is, especially if they have MacBooks, having their text messages on their computers. You know, a lot of times at school or in tutoring sessions, the phones are away, so it's not an immediate distraction. But if those text messages are coming through and they're on some sort of group chat, they could get like 40 messages, and, you know, it just sometimes just drags them away for a second or two. But I do really recommend, and, you know, I've had multiple students where I talk to them about like, let's turn that off, let's put it on do not disturb, let's just take this off this entire profile so that we're not getting those messages as we're in our focus time there.
All right, so shifting back to, or continuing with our 7 principles of learning. So in order for students to develop mastery, right, there's a bunch of stuff going on, right? They have to acquire the component skills, practice integrating them, but then also know how to apply them and what they've learned. And so, you know, the raw knowledge alone, raw memorization alone is generally not enough, right? There also has to be practice, right? Combining and integrating, working towards greater fluency or automaticity, right? The ability to sort of apply knowledge without taking a lot of mental effort to do so. And then finally, right, like when and how to actually apply those skills and the knowledge they've learned. So just as an example, most students at some point in their algebra career have to memorize the quadratic formula. And so great, they can like recite the letters, right? They can recite the formula. Some of us have learned a song to it, to Pop Goes the Weasel. But that alone, the formula alone is not really enough, right? They have to be able to practice actually using it. And then knowing, oh, this question right, this assignment calls on me to use this formula, whereas this other one is not, right? So it is this combination of practice that's required. And then finally here, right, the goal-directed practice has to be coupled with targeted feedback, right? And so we need both the goal, but the feedback to know, am I meeting my goal, or do I need to go back and try again? So here at AJ, one of the ways that we think about these goals, when students start academic tutoring with AJ, they complete what we call as a parent goal form, to get a little bit more background on where the student is currently and what, from a parent perspective, a student needs. And then as tutors, we take that and we craft the plan, right? Which is, like everything, an iterative process, right? But it gives us another point to say, okay, what is the plan? What is the feedback? And how do we know whether we've made it or not, right? That we need to continue adjusting. So kind of putting a lot of what we've talked about together, it starts in a lot of ways with the motivation. And this is a combination of having value, feeling that there's value in what you are doing, whether it's inherent value or sort of imposed from the outside. And then the expectancy. And expectancy is this idea that I think I should be able to do it, right? That with work, I will get there. And so from the motivation, it can lead to behavior which is towards my goal, right? I'm motivated to do it. So, right, let me work towards my goal. And that supports ultimately the learning, right? The behaviors are the process that gets me there. So having this goal, right, these behaviors direct my practice, right? Practice is literal practice, but also homework and studying and note-taking, right? All the things that I'm doing as part of my learning. It is, right, I can help evaluate this through observed performances, right? These are sort of assessment in the widest possible description of the word. So it could be a test or an essay from the classroom, but it can also just be my own, working through the homework and realizing, oh, something's not working, right? So there's, and then having targeted feedback, right? That the goal can shape the feedback I have. And these three ideas, these three things really support the goal-directed behavior. So the practice, the things that I'm doing, leads to what I'm then going to do in my performance and my assessment. The assessment allows for targeted feedback. And then the feedback that I get can guide further practice, right? Can shift what I'm doing, right? If it's working, great, let's keep doing it. And if not, need to make an adjustment. And then finally, all of this, right, the practice, the things that I'm doing inform the studying that I'm doing, which ultimately, right, all works together to create learning. And here, right, certainly in talking about assessment and feedback, I wanted to talk a little bit about the student-teacher relationship. Of course, as kids are younger, we play as outside parents, as adults, we play a larger role, and right, there's sort of an expectation of more independence as kids get a little bit older. But I do think no matter the age of the student, we can certainly support them in this. And just some guidelines that I've seen both as a classroom educator and also as a tutor. definitely we can help students to be respectful of their teachers, even when they're annoyed at their darkest time, right? That like, I can't believe my teacher graded me in this way. We can support students to reach out when they need additional help or additional feedback, and definitely making sure that we're helping students to phrase it in a respectful way. And then I found it's often really helpful when we ask for something, when a student is reaching out, to show the steps that the student has already taken, right? I looked back over my notes, I looked on, Canvas on the digital system, and I still wasn't sure, what the expectation was. Can you help me out? I definitely have had, again, not in all cases, but for students who are really struggling in a class, where in, consultation with both the student and the parent, we say, you know what, let's tell the teacher you just started working with a tutor, right? That you're taking the steps on your end to show that you really do want to do better and are working hard, and not just that we're asking the teacher for a favor, right? That generally doesn't go over so well. And then finally, especially important this time of year, not to wait until the end of the semester. As you can imagine, classroom teachers get inundated with students asking for special, a couple more points here, or, can I turn in that late assignment? And when we get to the end of the semester, frankly, teachers, get a little burned out on these things, and it becomes really challenging. And so definitely, if there's an issue, we want to reach out early so that there potentially is time to, to see what we can do with the, with the teacher.
Okay, so let's dive a little bit more into test preparation, because this is a really great opportunity to show what we know. It is also going to beget the learning that we're so interested in, and we've been noticing that schools have been pushing, some of our schools have been pushing a lot more towards assessments as a larger part of their grades, and thus students are kind of more and more focused on that. And we know it's something that takes a lot of energy out of our students. So thinking about test preparation, things that we can help our students do. I think the first and probably, I don't know, maybe most important part is before we're taking a test, we want to research what we're up against. I'm always surprised when I get a new student and I'm starting to ask them questions about the test, and the answer is, I don't know. Why would I why would I know that? But we want to know really as much as we can about this test going in. How long is it? How many questions? Do I get a calculator? What type of questions? Generally, what's it on? What's timing going to be like? All of that good stuff. And this is stuff that I find teachers are really, happy to give in most cases. Again, if we're asking respectively, or have already posted on their, kind of internal site. So really making sure we're working, the students are looking for what's on the test, and paying attention in class. A lot of times teachers will give students really key gold information, if they're ready to internalize that. The next thing we want to do for tests is plan ahead. We know that we need that spaced repetition. We know that we need space to actually retain this information. So as soon as we find out about a test, making sure we're backwards planning on when we're going to study for this, how we're going to integrate what we need to know, and all that good stuff. Next, we want to make sure that our work is working for us. Again, I've had so many students who come in and I read my notes, I'm studying, I'm done. No, we need to make sure that your studying for this test is productive for you. It's creating that active recall, and it's, in a manner that is somewhat palatable to you. If it's something where you absolutely hate studying, we're probably not going to do it that way. So what adjustments can we make to make the studying as productive as possible for the unique student? Next up is practicing and testing environments. So making sure that we are thinking through, if this is going to be a time pressure test, let's definitely make sure we're practice doing these questions under time pressure. If we know that this is a test that we're going to be doing, at the end of the day, make sure we're practicing these tests when we're tired or something like that. So make sure we're practicing that environment. Not having our notes, not having our phones, all of that stuff. Next up is planning for accuracy errors. And this is something I'm very passionate about. So teaching math for so many years, it is really important to me that students are thinking about these things as accuracy errors and understanding that these are not silly mistakes. These are not dumb mistakes. People are not making these mistakes because they're dumb or silly. We are humans and our brains don't work perfectly. So if we think about them as accuracy errors, we can plan for them. We know that in taking an assessment and taking a test, we're not going to operate perfectly. And to assume so would be silly. So when we're taking a test, we can think like, what can I do to minimize my accuracy errors? Probably labeling our work, writing carefully, that kind of stuff. And what can I do to find those accuracy errors? Probably checking our work, looking for common errors. So something, again, really passionate about is thinking about this as accuracy errors and planning for them. And a really powerful thing I find with a lot of my students is just creating a list of like their most common accuracy errors. You know, we're doing these homeworks, we're getting this feedback. Let's notice where we're making mistakes. They're probably predictable, right? It's probably negative signs. It's probably addition towards the end of the problem, something like that. So when you go into a test, you're not just chanting to yourself, check your work. You're saying, okay, I'm going to check my work if it makes, or I'm going to check that my answer makes sense within the scope of the problem. I'm then going to follow my negative signs and make sure that those all work out. I'm then going to check my arithmetic. And you have kind of an executable list instead of just that nebulous check your work. So very passionate about that. Next up is environmental factors. So just making sure that our students are, you know, aware of the environment in which they're taking the test. Is it something where they get really stressed out if people turn in the test before they're done? Planning for that, knowing that like, hey, we don't care if we finish first. We care that we did this well. And I'm going to see someone turning that in. It's going to be somewhat stressful to me. And I'm going to move on with that. You know, teenagers are also going through some emotional time. So making sure that if we are having one of those environmental factors that can't, you know, is outside of the class, but is still impactful, that we're aware of that. Like, hey, I may not perform my best today. X just happened. And then finally is reflection. When we're taking a test, the goal is to learn from it, right? This, you know, the teacher is giving it to you as a way to, you know, inform your grade, but also it's an opportunity to know what you know. And I honestly have a lot of trouble getting my students to engage up front with the reflection process. A lot of them can feel embarrassed or just not interested in talking about their mistakes, but they are the goal, and it's why we're doing all of this, because we want to know how we can improve for next time. So when we get a test back, asking ourselves, or even just when we finish a test, like, how did that feel? You know, what questions felt different than I would expect? What took me a lot of time? What did I feel like I went quickly through? So that when you get that grade back, you can then compare like, oh, this question took me a long time, but I did well. Or I went this really quickly through here, but I missed this question. And really put those together and start to build a plan for future assessments. Because I'm also very keen on the fact that like we are building skills in high school, right? Like these classes are exciting and they're important, but really we want to integrate these study skills for later on, and the reflection is going to be really important there. Also wanted to talk about kind of, again, those environmental factors and really the internal environment when a student's going into a test. There are a lot of axes that a student could fall on when approaching a test. Generally what I see with the majority of my students, it kind of goes on a energy spectrum and how they're feeling positive or negative. So, you know, I might have a student who's going to a test and is feeling really high energy negative. They're really nervous about this test. Or they're low energy negative. They're feeling really worried. And what I often find is students, when they're kind of envisioning their ideal testing environment, are trying to go too far. So if they're, you know, negative, low energy, they're trying to get back up to excited. They're trying to both change how positive they're feeling and the energy they're feeling. And that's more work. So I try to work with my students to make sure that they're focusing on getting to a side of the spectrum that is going to be productive, but is kind of less work. So if they're low energy negative, we're moving over to low energy positive. If they're high energy negative, we're moving over to high energy positive. This takes time, it takes practice, but I think is a good kind of mental shift overall. Cool. And then, you know, as tutors, we're always kind of on the lookout for what's coming up. And there are some, you know, big standardized tests that a lot of students need to take. And these are tests that we want to start even further ahead of, right? So want to kind of put it on your radar if you have any of these younger students, what those students might be up against going down the road, and when we might kind of start prepping for those things. But that's always something that people here at AJ are happy to chat with you through.
All right. So when we're thinking about time management, I think it is certainly, I know we already talked about screen time, but certainly it's relevant here as well. But so my sort of number one thing is to use a planner of some sort, right? Potentially a weekly planner. I think they take, all kinds of different formats, right? It could be a digital system, could be a paper calendar. I know when I was in school, the school sort of issued us like physical spiral bound planners that we were expected to physically write our homework into. For some students, maybe a simple to-do list is enough, but finding what works for the individual. And I find that having this physical record enables, or at least makes easier, a lot of the other things on this list. So I can have a prioritized to-do list because I have, there's something there. I can set goals and then I can go back and reference them, right? Did I meet the goal or not? Right? If I just say it, it becomes very ephemeral. It's really hard to then go back a week later. I can reflect on my progress. Again, the physical artifact or digital, right? But the thing that I can go back to allows me to reflect and to notice when there are issues, right? To ask questions early. And then certainly there are many different resources in terms of time management inventories to help students to be able to see, where are the places that they're struggling. I also, and it's a little bit tricky to do on your own, but if you can, or at least in some ways, helping students to be really honest with themselves of where the time is going. That, if they're getting distracted by their phone, like how much time did they actually spend? And again, it's not about an accusatory way, hopefully, but about, right, that this is the reflection, right? Like how much time actually is going in to this like random rabbit hole that you fell into. And now, right, you have been sitting doing homework kind of for hours and you weren't able to do the things you really wanted. But so that ability to reflect is really valuable. In relation to time management, here just a sample student schedule. But the reason I put this up here is that it's one thing to say, yeah, I plan to like study 3 times a week. It is quite a different thing to say, I plan to study 3 times a week. Here is my calendar and here's where it lives. Here's where it goes. Now, obviously, this is not a guarantee that it's actually going to happen, but it's an actionable goal that at the end of the week, I can reflect on and say, did I do it? Right? And maybe I didn't do it, but next week I see, really I can. Maybe I didn't do it and I need a better plan, right? That's going to fit my needs as an individual, as a student, as a learner. But right, these concrete goals I think are really important. I know, every student is different, of course. Large numbers of students that we work with, right, have lots of other things going on. They have school and sports practice can be really intense, and other extracurriculars. And so, really making sure we have a concrete plan to make that happen.
Great. Okay. Well, want to take a little bit of time to talk about sleep. And again, we know this is a really hard sell for a lot of students, but anything we can do here could really make a major impact because honestly, sleep makes a major difference in performance. Tutoring for as long as we have, Mike and I have kind of numerous examples of a student who, was fully prepped, was feeling good, knew the content, and then for whatever reason, didn't sleep the night before. Maybe they were trying to cram, maybe they're up late with a friend, and their performance dipped. And that's really sad to see when a student has, done the work and then, didn't get what they want here. So making sure that we're thinking about sleep on both that macro and micro level. And I think the key here is that in order for sleep to actually happen, you need to make it a priority. And for a lot of students, it's not an immediate priority. There's way more fun things out there to be doing than sleeping, but we really do need to make sure it's on our calendar, that we are thinking about it, that we are really working towards those goals to be able to achieve it. It's going to depend on the students, but the CDC has a couple of recommendations. Our 6 to 12-year-olds, hopefully between 9 to 12 hours of sleep, and our 13 to 18-year-olds, 8 to 10 hours. On that same page on the CDC, they'll tell you that I think 6 out of 10 6 to 12-year-olds are not getting that much sleep. And I think it was 8 out of 10 of the 13 to 18-year-olds also not getting that much sleep. So any progress we can make here could be super helpful. I also try, especially, in the test preparation landscape, as I'm helping a student prepare for the SAT and ACT, sleep is like a long-term cumulative thing, right? So even if we're sleeping the night before the test, we also really need to make sure that we're building solid sleep habits up into the test and really, overall. So a couple kind of broad guidelines that, where we want to start with our sleep plan is having a consistent sleep schedule can be really helpful. Having that calendared can be really helpful. Modeling as parents, having those consistent sleep schedules of when we both go to sleep and wake up. And then again, another hard sell, but limiting technology before bed. One kind of quick swap that I have found helpful for some of my students, and me personally, is instead of having the phone next to the bed for the alarm clock, just getting an old alarm clock from Target, $20. So when that alarm goes off, the first thing we do is not look at our phone and see what we missed overnight. The first thing we do is wake up there. But definitely a challenge for a lot of our students here. While we're talking about time management, I also want to talk through a couple digital time management apps. I love a time management app. I think there are some really fun ones out there that I like to kind of experiment with them with my tutors. So we'll send all this out after so you can review, see what might work well for you. But just to highlight a couple of these, I think Todoist is like a really professional way to go about the To-Do app. There's a lot of cool features in terms of tagging, sorting, giving priorities, timing, and you can really use it as much or as little as you want. And you could also have kind of family to-do lists where, maybe a teenager might not like getting assigned a task, but at least it shows up. So I really like that. Forest is a great one in that when you're using it, you say that you have your to-dos, and then when you're in the app, the time you spent on there, I think goes to help planting trees. And then if you log out of the app or go away from it, you stop planting the trees and they get sad. So you're getting that kind of, focus time as well. And then the other of these are great. I like Habitica. It makes things into a little game where students gain experience points for getting their to-dos done. But it's really about finding the to-do app that's going to be productive for your student, productive for your family, and that they're going to continue using. I have, through my life, done a lot of put all the tasks into a list, get overwhelmed by the list, and never look at the list again. So really making sure that we're creating a system that works well and is sustainable for our students there.
All right, so the last two of the 7 principles of learning. So 6 is, and these are sort of more looking forward, right? These are a lot of big picture. So a student's current level of development, right, interacts with all aspects, right? Social, emotional, and intellectual climate of the course, right? All of these outside factors impact the learning. And so we know, right, students are developing a full range of skills, both at school and at home. And that the climate of a classroom has a real effect for students. Obviously, as parents, we cannot have direct control over what happens at school, but certainly we can help foster supportive home environments. And then the other thing related to this is the prefrontal cortex, which is here in your more or less behind your forehead, among other things, supports planning, prioritizing, and making good decisions. And this is one of the last parts of the brain to fully develop. People who research this say generally somewhere in the mid-20s is when the prefrontal cortex is fully developed. And so I think for us as the adult in the room, it's helpful to remember in the back of our mind that in some cases, right, some of these, what we see as bad choices is developmentally appropriate, even if it's frustrating. And certainly, right, that doesn't, we obviously, of course, do want to help our students to develop these skills, right? But knowing that it is a process. And finally, the 7th principle, right? Ultimately, if our goal is to help students become self-directed learners, students have to learn to monitor and adjust their own approaches to learning, right? And so this is metacognition, right? Thinking about your own thinking. Some aspects of metacognition can be found in much younger kids, but generally speaking, researchers say that it really develops around 11 or 12 years old, so right around middle school, but obviously it continued, right? It's a ongoing development. So things like assessing a task, evaluating my own strengths and weaknesses to therefore say, what's the best way for me to approach this task? And then, right, looking in on ourselves and applying and monitoring those various strategies. All of these things are really important, but they tend not to be things that students and frankly people engage with naturally. And so as a result, these are things that we can really help students to begin to think about, right? These reflections. I think it would be awesome if students were able to do these things all along. I find in some cases, right, when things are not working, it provides an opportunity to reflect in a way that maybe when we're coasting along, it feels like extra work to a student. But certainly, right, these sorts of things are really important to improve, sort of short-term performance, but also their effectiveness as lifelong learners, right? These are important, skills that even if the specific course didn't turn out the way that the student hoped or we hoped, right? If we can develop some of these skills, right, this is important for a lifetime.
Great. Okay. And with that, our last study skill here we want to talk about is generalization and application. So taking that metacognition, how can we go deeper with our learning? This could be something that's really powerful to build over time. As I'm sure all of you know, like really getting into a topic and really learning deeply about something is so rewarding and so powerful. So as we kind of build these basic study skills, how can we do more? So first off is, like Micah said, that reflection and metacognition. And this is definitely something that we can help as parents here. Next up is leveled questioning. Can a student see a question, understand that it's difficult, and then decide what about it made it difficult? How can I make it less difficult? How could I make it more difficult? And this is something that is probably helpful, from a tutor or someone who's kind of an expert in the field, but also a skill that students can really start to build. And it's also great to start predicting tests, right? Like, let's get to know our teacher. We did all the research. We know what these tests looks like. What do we expect these questions to look like given what they've given us before? As we get more into a subject, really looking for those real world explorations. How does this apply? What can I bring this into my real life, my future life? And I think that's where we get a lot of our really, passionate students is like, where does this apply? What am I excited about here? If we have the time and energy, bringing in project-based learning, once we've built these fundamental skills, what can we build in the real world with it? What can we apply? What can we make? And then last off, trying to find a community where we can love these topics and learn together. I think we are in a really cool digital age where you can find people who are just as passionate about your niche topics as you are. And so finding these communities within a school, within a broader community is super powerful. So to kind of wrap up here, we wanted to provide a couple helpful resources kind of all together. The first thing I wanted to provide, and we've talked about a few of these so far, is just a couple language switches. And this is really going to depend on your student and what works well for them. But for just what I've noticed, so first and foremost, again, really passionate about not calling these silly or dumb mistakes. These are accuracy errors. I really like switching memorize to internalize. I've also noticed that the word help, something about it, students kind of bristle. So instead of saying, do you need help on something, I often change my language to say, would you benefit from support? We are working together, you get to benefit, you don't need anything. And I feel like that works well. Asking questions versus observation. So why isn't your homework done versus, hey, I noticed you're not in your homework spot and it's homework time, what's going on there? Can be more productive. And then last one, I think I've talked to a lot of parents and they describe their students as unfocused. A lot of time, or all the time, when I get in the room with the student, that student isn't necessarily unfocused. I don't know if I've ever really met an unfocused student. It's more that their focus is elsewhere. So instead of saying like, focus up, why are you unfocused here? It's, I noticed you're focused on this. Can we get to a spot where we can engage with this other content instead? We have a couple other, apps that I suggest. So we talked about our time management. We talked about note taking and how that can take a lot of different forms. Quizlet and Brainscape are a really cool way to work on that memorization. We got flashcards and kind of more key flashcards. If students want additional kind of generalization application, there's a lot of information on the internet. I like these two resources. And then in terms of text preparation, very much into the calendar, as Micah mentioned. And I really like this Calm app, which is actually a lot of insurances will provide a free kind of a subscription to, which will give students kind of breathing exercises, calming exercises for, making sure we're in that mind state for testing. And then you'll notice I didn't necessarily put any AI resources on here. I think it is very tempting for students now that there is, stuff out there that can instantly solve any problem they have to rely on those for actually doing the work. So I don't necessarily recommend them for my students, but if it is something where you feel like your student could use the resource responsibly, there are some really cool applications out there that can, create study plans, that can, quiz students on materials they know, that can, answer a question they don't know how to answer, and all that good stuff. Great. And then AJ Tutoring remains a resource. We're always here to help. If you have any questions after today, we'll have a Q&A in a minute, but if you have any specific questions for your student, we're happy to chat through that. Team of tutors excited to support. And then we do have a couple of resources on our YouTube channel about specific study skills. So I put the Pomodoro technique here, which is something that I'm very passionate about in terms of time management. If you'd like to check that resource out. So that concludes our content, and we really we got right to 8:02. Great work, team. So we'd love to open it up for a Q&A, see what y'all are curious about. If you are going to drop off here, we will send a recording of today as well as the slides after our presentation, and in that will include Mike and I's contact information. So if you have any questions that are very specific to your student, we're happy to answer those one-on-one. So we'll open it up to the floor. You're welcome to type your question in the chat or unmute yourself.
I have a question regarding the spaced repetition. Does it matter like the number of days in between, or just as long as you're reviewing it somewhat periodically in between the time to get the information to test time?
Yeah, great question. I would say, I think there is from the study like an optimal day, and I think it was 3 days. But I think for like practicality purposes, if a student is just regularly engaging with it, we're excited about that.
Okay. I do have another question if nobody else does. From the children you guys have tutored, is there any like note-taking format that has mostly, I guess, more universally used amongst different subjects?
So I think that the Cornell Notes system is flexible enough that it tends to be, kind of work across the board. Again, because really the focus is about having these key questions, right, that allow sort of focus for when you go back and study, and then the summary at the bottom. I hesitate to say there's one size fits all, frankly. I work with students on, among other things, history, and the kind of note that a student is taking for like a 9th grade history class looks so different from the kind of notes that are required for like AP US history, that it's hard to say one size fits all. But frankly, to me, anything we can get the student to do on a regular basis, that's great, right? And as long, obviously assuming it is working, right, and is helping the student achieve the goal. I'm a little less concerned on the exact format. I think lots of things can work.
Okay.
I will also say too, something in their own hand is really helpful. I think a lot of teachers will provide like very like outline notes, which I think is fantastic, in that the students can, get the information as while they're going through the test, or not through the test, through the class. But then they didn't really think through the organization. They didn't really think through the flow there. So potentially, if they're getting those types of notes, transferring it into a system that works well for them.
Got it. Okay.
I also find the like fill in the blank kind of note that teachers sometimes provide really end up creating, frankly, a little bit more of a scavenger hunt. And I've seen students where like they're not really reading, they're looking for like the word that fills in the blank.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Thank you.
A question. So how much time do you think should students be spending in kind of preparing for their application or writing applications versus like regular studies? Like, do you recommend some sort of proportion or dividing their week into certain days?
Yeah, so I imagine this would be like, seniors applying to college this year.
No, this is like a 7th, 8th graders like applying for some private schools for 8th grade. Just kind of like an extra opportunity, like, if 9th grade doesn't work for a private high school, then maybe just start early to kind of get some warm up, or maybe if he can get early into a private school, that's better.
I don't know that I have like a specific, sort of like proportional breakdown. I definitely talk with parents about, that there is not exactly a trade-off, right? But there is sort of a balancing act, right? For sure. I think that, definitely I would want to make sure that their academics are not suffering as a result of whatever additional preparation a student is doing. I think that, with a little bit of work on the time management, I think there really is time for both. And if it's something that, in a specific case we're concerned about, I think it is often helpful to start a little bit earlier, right? So that we have that time cushion to be able to really give it the time that we want, even if the student is really busy with their academics and, whatever other extracurriculars they're doing. Yeah, hopefully that helps a little.
What kind of help does AJ Tutoring provide for writing application for 8th grade admission?
Yeah, so we have a pretty wide spectrum of offerings. So we support students with, thinking about the essays that they are providing, as part of the application itself. This is true also for college applications, though, often it's different tutors. We also support students to prepare for a timed essay that's a part of many high school applications. And then depending on the school, there's sometimes sort of tests and assessments, for those. And then the other piece is a lot of schools now have sort of interview style assessments that students are going through. Sometimes they're one-on-one with a teacher or an administrator. Sometimes the students are in groups with others, so that, the school gets to kind of look at their interaction. But so we support on all those things, right? And definitely, this is definitely true for our younger students, right? For 7th, 8th graders applying. I think this is also true for high school seniors thinking about college application, that it's really important that it is the voice of the student. These, whether we're talking about college admissions officers or high school admissions officers, right? Like they can tell that it's the student writing versus the parent writing versus, a tutor writing. And we want to make sure that it's authentic to the student.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Yeah, to answer the chat, the question in the chat, study skills are a major priority here at AJ. Like we are really focused on helping students become lifelong learners. And so everything we can do to show them these study skills, model them, and then help them sort of integrate them into their own lives is a big priority for us for sure.
Do you guys have any tips for, I guess, how to help a child recognize when they're off track during homework time or in the evenings there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with modeling the language, like when we ourselves notice that we're off track, like, oh, I really got dragged into that. And then hopefully we've set up the digital space so that it's very obvious that they're off track, right? They've picked their phone and we can say, hey, I noticed you're on your phone and it's study time kind of thing. And just giving them that language to be able to, express and notice that they've got off track, I think is helpful.
Did you mean off track in terms of like a time management side or in terms of like effectiveness in learning? Or maybe both?
Oh, like a time management side.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Well, Mike and I are happy to stick on for a few more minutes if anyone has any kind of lingering questions. But again, we'll kind of send out our contact information after today. So if you have any specific questions about your student, we are always happy to chat through that. But we wish you all the best and luck in integrating these study skills. It's so exciting to see so many parents excited to help their students in this way. And we are definitely here to help. So we hope everyone has a lovely rest of their evening. And if we can help in any way, let us know. Yeah, Caroline. Yeah, Caroline, did you have a question? Perfect. All right. Well, I will end the meeting there. Everyone have a lovely night and happy to chat over email or phone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.